Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again. Carl Jung on healing, the shadow and inner safety. If you enjoy this video, please like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel continue to grow and create content like this. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again. Those words sound like a promise, almost too clean for a world that has cut us so many times. When I first heard a version of that sentence in my own life, I didn't trust it. It sounded like denial, like superstition, like something you say to a frightened child in the dark. But with age, and with a long conversation with my own inner world, I've come to understand that this sentence isn't about protection from pain. It's about a different relationship to pain altogether. When you're young, hurt feels like invasion. Something enters you without permission. A word, a look, an absence. You bleed inwardly and don't yet know how to stop the bleeding. In Jungian terms, the ego is still thin-skinned then. It hasn't learned the difference between what belongs to it and what belongs to the world. So everything lands directly on the heart. I remember a man I used to be, quick to take things personally, slow to recover. If someone withdrew affection, I felt erased. If someone criticized me, I felt exposed, as if my inner scaffolding had been kicked out. At the time, I thought this meant I was sensitive. What it really meant was that my inner boundaries had not yet formed. Jung understood this fragility deeply. He saw that much of our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from unconscious identification. We fuse with our wounds. We believe the insult defines us, the rejection reveals the truth about us, the loss proves something final and terrible. The psyche, when unexamined, treats every emotional injury as evidence. But here's what changes with inner work, with age, with honest reflection: you stop mistaking impact for identity. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again does not mean you won't feel pain. You will still feel disappointment. You will still grieve. You will still wince at cruelty. But the pain will no longer enter the center of you unchallenged. It will arrive, yes, but it will knock. This is where the self comes in. Not the ego, which is always trying to defend, justify, or control, but the deeper organizing center Jung called the self. The self is vast enough to hold contradiction. It does not panic when the world turns sharp. When you begin to live in relation to it, pain becomes information instead of annihilation. In the first half of life, we're busy building defenses. We armor ourselves with achievement, usefulness, charm, intellect. These defenses work, but they're exhausting. They require constant maintenance. And when they fail, as all defenses eventually do, we feel betrayed by life itself. The second half of life invites something quieter: integration. Instead of trying to prevent hurt, you learn to metabolize it. The shadow plays a crucial role here. The parts of you that were hurt early, humiliated, abandoned, or silenced don't disappear just because you grow older. They wait. And if ignored, they remain tender forever. But when you turn toward them, really turn, you begin to change the structure of your inner world. The wound stops being an open doorway. It becomes a scar. Scars don't disappear, but they don't bleed. I've sat with people near the end of their lives who understood this. They had been betrayed, divorced, misunderstood by children, passed over by careers. And yet they spoke without bitterness. Not because they forgot what happened, but because what happened no longer defined where they lived inside themselves. One woman once told me, "I still remember every hurt. They just don't live here anymore." She tapped her chest lightly when she said it. That is the psychological truth behind the sentence. When nothing and nobody can hurt you again, it's because you no longer hand your inner authority to the outer world. You've withdrawn the projections. You've stopped asking people to carry your worth, your safety, your meaning. This doesn't make you cold. In fact, it does the opposite. You become more compassionate, because you no longer need others to behave perfectly in order for you to remain intact. You can see their wounds without absorbing them as your own. The ego resists this at first. It mistakes vulnerability for danger. It says, "If I don't react, I'll disappear." But the self knows better. The self knows that what you are cannot be injured by words alone, by moods alone, by the unpredictable weather of human behavior. This is not spiritual bypassing. Jung warned strongly against that. If you rush to transcend pain without understanding it, the pain returns in symptoms, in anxiety, bitterness, illness, compulsion. True safety comes only after contact. Contact with your grief. Contact with your anger. Contact with the truth of what hurt you and why. When you allow that contact, something unexpected happens. The wound loses its power to ambush you. It no longer jumps out from behind ordinary moments. It becomes known territory. And known territory is no longer terrifying. That's where the sentence becomes real. From that place, something profound shifts in how you walk through the world. You stop scanning rooms for threat. You stop rehearsing arguments in advance. You stop bracing yourself for abandonment as if it were a certainty waiting just around the corner. Not because the world has become kinder, but because your inner ground has become firmer. Jung believed that what we fear most in others is often what remains unintegrated in ourselves. When you haven't made peace with your own anger, someone else's anger feels lethal. When you haven't accepted your own capacity for rejection, someone else's distance feels like erasure. But as these inner figures are welcomed back home, their outer counterparts lose their terror. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again because you no longer confuse emotional intensity with existential danger. There is a moment in inner development where you realize that pain does not mean punishment. It does not mean failure. It does not mean you chose wrong or loved wrong. It simply means something touched you deeply. That realization alone dissolves decades of unnecessary self-blame. I've noticed this most clearly in relationships. When you're young, love feels like exposure. You offer your heart and pray it won't be dropped. When you're older, when you've done the inner work, love feels like offering warmth rather than safety. If someone leaves, it hurts, yes, but it does not collapse the house of your being. That's individuation in motion. You also begin to notice how often you once tried to make yourself invulnerable through control. Control of schedules. Control of narratives. Control of other people's perceptions. Jung would say that control is the ego's substitute for trust in the self. When that trust grows, control relaxes. And when control relaxes, fear loosens its grip. This doesn't mean you tolerate abuse or betrayal. On the contrary, your boundaries become clearer. You walk away sooner. Not in anger, not in drama, but in recognition. You no longer need to prove that something hurt. You simply acknowledge that it doesn't belong in your life. This is one of the quiet gifts of aging, discernment without hostility. I once believed strength meant endurance, how much pain you could absorb without breaking. Now I believe strength means knowing when pain no longer needs to be absorbed at all. The psyche matures when it learns the difference between necessary suffering and unnecessary repetition. Dreams often mark this shift. People begin to dream of solid houses, of locked doors that feel protective rather than frightening, of animals that stand calmly at their side instead of chasing them. The unconscious is saying, "You are no longer exposed." And yet life continues to test this truth. Loss arrives. Bodies fail. People disappoint. The difference is not in what happens, but in where it lands. It lands on the surface now, not at the core. That core, the self, is not untouched by life, but it is not undone by it. When someone speaks harshly to you, you feel the sting, but it doesn't become a story about your worth. When someone withdraws love, you grieve, but you do not disappear with them. When the world feels unstable, you feel concern, not panic. This is what psychological safety looks like from the inside. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again because you have stopped asking the world to guarantee what only the inner world can provide. And this is where compassion deepens. Once you are no longer ruled by your wounds, you begin to see how wounded everyone else is. Not in a patronizing way, but in a human way. You recognize the fear behind cruelty, the longing behind control, the grief behind indifference. You don't excuse harm, but you no longer personalize it. At the end of life, this matters more than almost anything. I have heard people say, with quiet astonishment, "I spent so many years being afraid of being hurt, and in the end, the hurt was never the problem." What they meant was that unexamined fear had cost them more than any single wound ever did. So if this sentence feels impossible right now, let it be a direction rather than a demand. It is not something you declare. It is something you grow into. Through honesty. Through grief. Through integration. Through a relationship with yourself that does not collapse under pressure. And one day, perhaps quietly, perhaps without ceremony, you'll notice that something has changed. The world hasn't softened, but you have strengthened in a different way. You still feel. You still care. You still risk connection. But the center holds. And from that place, the sentence is no longer a fantasy. It is simply a description of how it feels to be at home in yourself.